Imagine one of the NBA's biggest stars discovering that for 9 years, his entire life was built upon a secret that his wife kept in silence. A secret so profound that when it finally came to light, Steph Curry couldn't contain his tears. What Ayesha hid from him for nearly a decade would forever change how he views his own success. And when you discover what it was about, you'll understand why this revelation shook not just a marriage, but redefined the meaning of true partnership. The sound of the garage door closing echoed through the house in Atherton like a heavy sigh. Steph Curry entered through the kitchen, still wearing his Warriors warm-up gear, his shoulders curved under the weight of another frustrating defeat. The January rain drummed against the panoramic windows, creating a melancholic rhythm that seemed to perfectly match his state of mind. 42 points. He had scored 42 points that night against the Lakers, and still it wasn't enough. At 36 years old, Steph felt each defeat like a cruel reminder that time was passing, that opportunities to win another title were becoming rarer. "Hi, honey." Ayesha's soft voice came from the living room, but there was something different about it. An almost imperceptible tension that Steph, even in his state of exhaustion, could detect after 15 years of marriage. He found her sitting on the white leather sofa, a cup of tea still steaming in her hands. Riley, 12 years old, had just gone upstairs to do her homework, and Ryan, 9, was already asleep. Cannon, at 5 years old, was probably playing in his room. The house was in that state of controlled calm that Ayesha always managed to maintain, no matter how chaotic the day had been. "How was the game?" she asked, but Steph could see in her eyes that she already knew the answer. Ayesha always watched, even when he was playing away games. She had followed every shot, every assist, every moment of his frustration on the court. "We lost by 5. Steph let himself fall onto the sofa beside her, taking off his shoes without untying them. "I can't understand it, Ayesha. I'm playing well, the numbers are good, but the team, it feels like something is missing." Ayesha placed her cup on the coffee table and turned to face him completely. There was an intensity in her gaze that Steph rarely saw, a mixture of determination and vulnerability that made him momentarily forget his own frustration. "Steph," she began, her voice lower now, "do you remember 2015? When you were fighting to prove your worth in the league? When people still doubted whether you could be a true leader?" He frowned. Of course he remembered. Those were difficult years, when he was establishing his identity as a player, when every game seemed like a battle to earn respect. "Of course, why? Do you remember how we always talked about money back then? How I always said everything was fine? That we could pay the bills?" Steph nodded slowly. They weren't struggling. His NBA salary was respectable, but they also didn't have the financial security they would have years later. "Yes, you always reassured me about that." Ayesha took a deep breath, and Steph noticed her hands trembling slightly. She interlaced her fingers to control them, a gesture he knew well. She did this when she was nervous or about to say something important. "Steph, there's something I never told you about that period." Her voice was almost whispering now. "Something I kept for all these years because I didn't want you to feel pressured or guilty." Steph's heart began to beat faster. In 15 years of marriage, Ayesha had never started a conversation this way. She was direct, honest, transparent. If there was something she had hidden for so long. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice coming out more hoarse than he intended. Ayesha stood up and went to the window, watching the rain that continued to fall. She stayed there for a moment, gathering courage, before turning to face him again. Do you remember how I was always busy during that time? How I always seemed to have 1,000 projects happening at the same time? Yes, you were always entrepreneurial. Your cooking blogs, the TV attempts. They weren't just attempts, Steph. Ayesha returned to the sofa, but didn't sit down. Instead, she stood in front of him, her hands clasped in front of her body. There was much more happening than you knew. Steph could feel the tension growing in the room. Outside, the rain intensified, beating against the windows with more force. He leaned forward, completely focused on his wife. Ayesha, you're scaring me. What's happening? She sat on the edge of the coffee table, facing him, her knees almost touching his. When she spoke again, her voice was firm, but Steph could see tears beginning to form in her eyes. Steph, I need to tell you about the last 9 years, about things I did, sacrifices I made, that you never knew about. And I need to tell you this now because... She paused, swallowing hard. Because you deserve to know the truth about how we got here. Steph felt his stomach tighten. What truth, Ayesha? She reached out and touched his face gently. The truth about what really happened behind the scenes of your rise to stardom. The truth about sacrifices you never imagined I made. And the truth about why I kept this from you for so long. The room fell silent, except for the sound of rain and the clock on the wall, marking the seconds. Steph could feel his heart beating so hard he was sure Ayesha could hear it. I don't know if I'm ready to hear this, he admitted. Ayesha smiled through the tears that now flowed freely down her face. I know, honey. But after 9 years carrying this alone, I'm finally ready to share this weight with you. Ayesha stood up and lit the fireplace, her hands trembling slightly as she lit the match. The flames began to dance, creating moving shadows on the living room walls. Steph watched her in silence, trying to prepare for what was coming. Do you remember 2015, when Riley was born? Ayesha began, returning to sit beside him on the sofa. You were focused on establishing yourself as the Warriors' starting point guard, and I was trying to balance being a first-time mother with all my ambitions. Steph nodded. Those were intense months. He was finally gaining respect in the league, but the pressure was constant. Of course they were. Difficult, but also exciting times. For you, maybe. Ayesha looked at the flames. For me, they were the most challenging months of my life, and you never knew why. She took a deep breath before continuing. Steph, do you remember how I was always working on my projects? The cooking blog, the TV appearances, the events? Yes, you were always ambitious. I admired that about you. They weren't just ambitions, Steph. It was necessity. Ayesha turned to face him completely. Your rookie salary, even being from the NBA, didn't cover everything we needed. Especially not the way we wanted to live, with the house, the car, the clothes that an NBA player's wife needs to have to be respected. Steph frowned. But we always managed to pay our bills. Yes, we did. But you never asked how. Tears began to stream down Ayesha's face. Steph, during the first 5 years of our marriage, I worked 3, sometimes 4 different jobs at the same time. And you never knew. Steph's world stopped. What do you mean? I did private catering on weekends. Not just the fancy events you knew about. I did lunches for companies, dinners for wealthy families, birthday parties at houses I never told you about. Some Saturdays, I woke up at 4 in the morning to prepare food for 3 different events. Steph was processing every word, but couldn't fully understand. Ayesha, why didn't you ever tell me? Because you were fighting to prove yourself on the court. Ayesha stood up abruptly, beginning to pace around the room. You were facing criticism about your size, about your strength, about whether you could really be a starting point guard in the NBA. The last thing you needed was to worry about money. But we were a team. Exactly. We were a team. Ayesha stopped in front of him, her eyes shining with emotion. And my job on that team was to ensure that you could focus on yours. So I took on the financial responsibility that you didn't even know existed. Steph stood up too, trying to process what he was hearing. What other things did you do that I didn't know about? Ayesha wiped her face with the back of her hand. Do you remember when I started selling jewelry online? You thought it was just a hobby. Yes, you said it was just for fun. I was earning $3,000 a month selling jewelry, Steph. $3,000 that paid our mortgage. Her voice was breaking now. And at night, after you slept, I stayed awake until 2, 3 in the morning answering. Emails, processing orders, planning marketing campaigns. Steph sat heavily on the sofa again. My God, Ayesha. And do you want to know the hardest part? Ayesha sat beside him, taking his hands. It wasn't the sleepless nights. It wasn't the physical exhaustion. It was having to hide from you when I was completely exhausted. It was having to smile and say everything was fine when you came home after a difficult game, because I knew you needed support, not another worry. Why didn't you ever tell me? I could have helped, could have found other ways. How? Ayesha interrupted him gently. You were earning $850,000 a year, Steph. It sounds like a lot, but after taxes, the agent, expenses, and we wanted to live in a good house, in a safe neighborhood, have decent clothes. All of that costs money. Steph was beginning to understand the magnitude of what his wife had done. How many hours a day were you working? Between taking care of Riley, managing the house, my catering jobs, the online store, the blogs, I'd say between 14 and 16 hours a day. Ayesha smiled sadly. Sometimes I wondered how I managed to function on 3 or 4 hours of sleep. And I never noticed. Steph ran his hands over his face. How did I never notice? Because I became very good at hiding it. When you came home after practices, I had already finished most of my online work. When you woke up in the morning, I was already dressed and ready, even if I had only slept a few hours. Steph remembered those years, how Ayesha always seemed to have infinite energy, how she was always involved in multiple projects. He had admired her ambition, but never questioned where all that drive came from. Do you remember 2016, when the Warriors reached the finals? Ayesha continued. You were so focused on the playoffs that you barely noticed I was pregnant with Ryan and still maintaining all my jobs. You were pregnant, working 16 hours a day? I had to work, Steph. Ryan needed a college fund. We needed a bigger car, a bigger house, and your salary, even having increased, still didn't cover everything we wanted to provide for our family. Steph stood up and began pacing around the room, running his hands through his hair. Ayesha, I feel terrible. I feel like I failed as a husband. No. Ayesha stood up quickly and went to him. You didn't fail at anything. You did exactly what you needed to do. You focused on your game, improved every year, and eventually became the player you always knew you could be. But at your expense. Not at my expense, Steph. In partnership with me. Ayesha held his face in her hands. Do you want to know why I did all this? Why I endured sleepless nights? Why I worked to exhaustion? Why I hid everything from you? Steph nodded, not trusting his voice. Because I saw your potential before you even saw it yourself. I knew that if you had the mental freedom to focus only on basketball, you would become something special. And I was right. Tears now flowed freely down Steph's face. Ayesha, I invested in us, Steph, in our future. And it was worth every hour of lost sleep, every moment of exhaustion, every time I had to smile when I was almost breaking down. Ayesha smiled through her own tears, because look where we got. Look what we built together. Steph pulled her into a tight embrace, finally beginning to comprehend the true extent of the sacrifices his wife had made for their family, for his dreams, for his success. Steph held Ayesha in his arms for long minutes, both crying silently. When they finally separated, he could see his own reflection in her moist eyes, and what he saw shook him deeply. A man who had lived years of his life without fully understanding the sacrifices that made his success possible. Ayesha, he began, his voice hoarse with emotion. I need to understand. When you say you hid the exhaustion from me, what did that mean in practice? She sat on the sofa, pulling a pillow to her lap, as if it were an emotional shield. Do you remember those mornings when you woke up and I was already in the kitchen preparing your breakfast, always smiling, always excited for your day? Steph nodded, a vivid memory emerging in his mind. Half of those mornings, I hadn't slept even 2 hours. I would work on online orders until 3 in the morning, sleep a little on the sofa, and wake up at 5:30 to be ready when you came downstairs. Ayesha paused, looking at her hands. Sometimes I fell asleep standing up while making your coffee. My God! Steph sat beside her, taking her hands. And I never noticed? You had some suspicions. Remember that time in 2016 when you asked me if I was okay because I seemed different? Steph vaguely remembered. Yes, you said you were just tired because of the pregnancy. I was exhausted to the bone, Steph. That week I had worked a catering event on Saturday, stayed awake all Sunday night processing online orders, and on Monday I still had to take Riley to the doctor and go shopping. Tears began to stream down Ayesha's face again. When you asked me if I was okay, I almost broke down and told you everything. But you had an important game that night against the Cavaliers. I remember that game. We won 73 games that season. Steph stopped, realizing something. Ayesha, how many of my great games coincided with your worst nights? Ayesha smiled sadly. Do you really want to know? Yes, I need to know. Do you remember the game against Oklahoma City in 2016 when you made 12 three-pointers? Of course, it was one of the best games of my career. That morning, I had finished working at 4:30. I had a catering event on Friday, 2 urgent jewelry orders to process, and Ryan had a fever all night. Ayesha looked directly at him. When you woke up at 9, excited for the game, I was already dressed, made up, with coffee, ready, and a smile on my face. Steph felt like he had been punched in the stomach. How many times did this happen? Steph, for 3 years, this was our reality 3 or 4 times a week. He stood up abruptly, beginning to pace around the room again. How did you manage to keep this up? How did you not break down? Because I had a greater purpose. Ayesha stood up too, going to the fireplace. Every time I was at my limit, I remembered why I was doing it. I looked at you preparing for a game, saw your determination, your passion, and knew that my role was to create the conditions so you could give your best. But what about your dreams? Your ambitions? My dreams were intertwined with ours, Steph. I wasn't just supporting your career. I was building our family, our future. Ayesha turned to face him. And you know what? I discovered talents in myself that I never knew I had. I became an entrepreneur out of necessity, and that shaped who I am today. Steph stopped pacing and looked at her with a mixture of admiration and guilt. But the personal cost? It was high, yes. There were nights when I cried in the shower because I was too exhausted to think straight. There were mornings when I looked at myself in the mirror and didn't recognize the person looking back. Ayesha paused, taking a deep breath. But do you know what kept me strong? What? Seeing you grow as a player, seeing you gaining confidence, watching others recognize your talent. Every time you had a great game, every time you broke a record, I knew my sacrifices were worth it. Steph approached her, taking her hands. Ayesha, I feel like I've lived a lie all these years. It wasn't a lie, Steph. It was a partnership where each of us did what was necessary. She squeezed his hands. You did your part being the best player you could be. I did my part creating the conditions for that to be possible. But I should have noticed. I should have questioned more, should have insisted on helping. And if you had noticed, what would have happened? Ayesha asked gently. You would have felt guilty, would have been distracted, maybe wouldn't have played as well. And then all my sacrifices would have been in vain. Steph thought about this, processing her logic. But it wasn't fair to you. Life isn't always fair, Steph, but it can be meaningful. And everything I went through, all the sacrifices I made, they had meaning because look where we got. Ayesha gestured around the room, but Steph knew she was referring to much more than the house. Look at our family, your legacy, the opportunities we created for our daughters. But what if I had never gotten where I got? What if all your sacrifices hadn't been worth it? Ayesha smiled, and for the first time that night, it was a completely genuine smile. Then I would have the certainty that I gave everything I had for the person I love, and that, by itself, would have been worth it. Steph pulled her into another embrace, this time really able to absorb the magnitude of love and dedication his wife had demonstrated. He was beginning to understand that his success wasn't just his, it was theirs, built on foundations he had never seen, but that had always been there, solid and unshakable. Why are you telling me this now? He asked, still embracing her. Because, Ayesha pulled away to look into his eyes. After all these years watching you carry the weight of being the leader, of being the example, of being the provider, I wanted you to know that you were never alone on this journey. And I wanted you to know that everything we achieved together. Morning came with a clear sky after the previous night's rain. Steph woke up earlier than usual, the events of the night before still echoing in his mind like a movie he couldn't stop watching. Beside him, Ayesha slept deeply, and for the first time in years, he really observed her sleeping, noticing the small lines around her eyes that told the story of years of sacrifice she had revealed. Silently, he went down to the kitchen. For 9 years, Ayesha had prepared his breakfast almost every day, even when she was exhausted to the point of collapse. Today would be different. Steph began preparing the special coffee that Ayesha liked, that expensive blend she always said was unnecessary, but that he knew she loved. While the coffee brewed, he prepared Eggs Benedict, her favorite dish that she rarely requested because she knew how much work it took to make. Steph? Ayesha's sleepy voice came from the stairs. What are you doing awake so early? He turned to see her coming down, wearing the silk robe he had given her for Christmas. Even having just woken up, even with disheveled hair, she was still the most beautiful woman he had ever seen. "Making breakfast for the woman who spent 9 years making breakfast for me," he replied, indicating the chair at the kitchen island. "Sit there." Ayesha smiled, but there was hesitation in her eyes. "Steph, about last night. I don't want you to feel guilty or—" "Ayesha," he interrupted her gently, placing a perfectly prepared cup of coffee in front of her. "I spent the whole night thinking about everything you told me. And you're right about one thing. We are a team. But what I realized is that during all these years, I was playing an individual game thinking it was teamwork." He placed the plate of eggs Benedict in front of her, prepared exactly as she liked it. "This stops here and now." "What do you mean?" Steph sat beside her, taking her hands. "I mean, it's time for me to give back. It's time for me to be the partner you always were for me." "Steph, you don't need to—" "Yes, I do." He squeezed her hands gently. "Ayesha, you invested 9 years of your life in my success. Now, it's my turn to invest in yours." Ayesha's eyes filled with tears. "What are you talking about?" "I'm talking about using everything we built together to realize your dreams now. You want to expand your culinary brand? Let's do it. You want to open that restaurant you always dreamed of? Consider it done. You want to write a book, do a TV show, start a product line? Whatever you want, we're going to make it happen. Steph, and more importantly," he continued, "I'm going to be truly present, not just physically, but mentally, emotionally. Because now I understand that my success was only possible because you carried half the weight without me realizing it." Ayesha was crying openly now. "I didn't do that expecting something in return." "I know, and that's exactly why you deserve everything." Steph stood up and went to the other side of the kitchen, returning with an envelope. "Actually, I already started." "What is this?" "Last night, after you went to sleep, I called my lawyer." Steph opened the envelope, revealing legal documents. "This is the incorporation of Ayesha Curry Enterprises with an initial investment of $2 million. It's your company, your brand, your future." Ayesha looked at the documents, incredulous. "Steph, this is... It's the least I can do for the woman who worked 3 jobs while pregnant so I could pursue my dreams." He knelt beside her chair. "Ayesha, you spent 9 years being my silent partner. Now I want to be your vocal partner. I don't know what to say. Say you'll let me help you build everything you always wanted to build. Say you'll let me give back, even if it's just a fraction of everything you did for me." Ayesha held his face in her hands. "You know you don't need to do this to pay back what I did, right? I did it out of love." "I know, and it's out of love that I'm doing this too." Steph smiled. "Besides, I have plans for tonight." "What plans?" "You'll see." That night, after Warriors practice, Steph was in the press conference room. There were about 20 journalists present, expecting the usual questions about game strategy, team injuries, and expectations for the season. Steph, an ESPN reporter, began, "How are you feeling about the team's performance lately?" Steph looked directly at the camera, thinking about Ayesha watching at home. "Before talking about basketball, I'd like to talk about partnership. You know, every successful player has a team behind him. Coaches, teammates, staff. But sometimes, the most important person on your team is the one who never appears in the statistics." The journalists looked at each other, not expecting this type of response. "My wife, Ayesha, spent the last 9 years making sacrifices I didn't even know existed. She worked multiple jobs, lost nights of sleep, carried responsibilities that should have been mine, all so I could focus on basketball. Steph paused, his voice loaded with emotion. Every time you ask me about leadership, about what it means to be a champion, the answer is at home, probably preparing dinner for our children while managing 3 different businesses. The room was completely silent now. So, before answering about our performance as a team, I want everyone to know that everything I achieved, all the records, all the titles, were built on the foundation of an extraordinary woman's sacrifice who never asked for recognition for it. Steph smiled. Ayesha, if you're watching, thank you for being my true MVP during all these years. He stood up from the table. Now I can answer about basketball. At home, Ayesha watched on TV, tears streaming down her face. Riley and Ryan were beside her on the sofa, also moved to see their father publicly recognizing their mother in a way he had never done before. "Mom," Riley said softly, "Dad is right. You've always been our MVP." Ayesha hugged her daughters, realizing that something had fundamentally changed in their family that night. The secret she had carried for 9 years was no longer a solitary burden. Now it was a story of love, sacrifice, and partnership that the whole family could celebrate. When Steph arrived home an hour later, he found Ayesha waiting at the garage door, something she hadn't done in years due to the exhaustion of her multiple responsibilities. "So," she said, smiling through her tears, "you really did it. You told the whole world." "I told the truth. That should have been told a long time ago." Steph hugged her tightly. "And this is just the beginning, Ayesha. From now on, every victory of ours will be truly ours." That night, as they prepared for bed, Steph looked at Ayesha and realized something he had missed during all those years of intense focus on his career. He had spent so much time pursuing individual greatness that he almost lost sight of the greatness that existed right beside him every day. "Ayesha," he said softly, "thank you for loving me enough to carry that weight alone. And thank you for trusting me enough to finally share it with me." She smiled. And for the first time in 9 years, it was a smile completely free from the weight of unrevealed secrets. "Thank you for being ready to listen." And that night, for the first time in almost a decade, Ayesha Curry slept with the certainty that she was no longer alone in building the Curry family's dreams. True teamwork, finally, had begun. 3 months later, Ayesha Curry Enterprises would launch its first line of culinary products. 6 months later, she would sign a contract for her own cooking show. And 1 year later, she would open her first restaurant in San Francisco. But more important than any professional success was the change in the Curry family dynamics. Steph began coming home earlier, participating more actively in household responsibilities, and ensuring that Ayesha's dreams received the same priority that his had always received. Ayesha's revelation didn't destroy their marriage. It transformed it. Because sometimes, the most difficult truth to tell is also the one that most liberates. And sometimes, the greatest act of love isn't carrying a burden alone, but trusting the loved one enough to share it. In the end, Steph Curry learned that being a true MVP doesn't just mean dominating individually, but recognizing and elevating the MVPs who are beside you. And Ayesha learned that some secrets, even those kept out of love, are more powerful when shared. From that January night on, the Currys were no longer just Steph Curry and family. They were truly a team, with 2 MVPs, working together, building together, dreaming together. And that, perhaps, was the greatest victory of Steph Curry's career.